Good morning, everyone, and welcome. It's nice to see the auditorium so full. And welcome to everyone watching us via the webcast and the Zoom. Just to explain today's event, there'll be a press conference starting now, in which OECD Secretary-General Mathias Cormann will present the report's key findings, and then Andreas Schleicher, the OECD Director for Education and Skills, will go into some more details. We'll then have time for some questions and answers. There'll be a very short break at 11:55, and then we'll move into a panel discussion starting at midday. Virtual appearances from Denis Shmyhal, the Prime Minister of Ukraine, Lee Joo-ho, the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Education of Korea, Christina Kallas, the Minister of Education and Research for Estonia, and Masahito Moriyama, the Minister of Education, Culture, Sports, Science and Technology, Japan. And just to remind people, the press conference will be in English. There is interpretation in French, Japanese and Korean. Thank you very much. Secretary General.
Well, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon for some of you joining us remotely around the world. And a very warm welcome to this global launch of the 2022 results for the OECD's flagship program for international student assessment, or PISA, as it is affectionately known. Since its launch in 2000, PISA has become the world's most comprehensive and reliable indicator when it comes to benchmarking students' knowledge and skills in reading, mathematics and science across countries. PISA is a powerful tool that policymakers can use to ensure that education systems are as effective as they can be. PISA 2022 again helps to identify the comparative strengths of education systems that have performed well despite recent shocks, and why. It enables policymakers across the 81 participating countries and economies to rely on these insights, adapting them to their particular circumstances as required, and to pursue reforms to their education systems to achieve better outcomes into the future. Education and skills are fundamental to ensuring young people have the best possible opportunities to develop, to adapt to a rapidly changing world, to contribute and to benefit from the opportunities in front of them in our economies and societies. Since our last PISA assessment in 2018, the environment for our education systems has changed profoundly. From the impact of a significant external shock like the COVID-19 pandemic to the impact of ongoing structural transformations, in particular the accelerating and deepening digital transformation of our societies around the world. The pandemic and the digital transformation in particular have had and continue to have major implications for the knowledge and skills students will need going forward. The 8th round of PISA, originally scheduled for 2021 and postponed due to the COVID-19 pandemic, includes results from nearly 700,000 students from 81 member and partner economies, representing 29 million people across the world. This makes PISA 2022 the first large-scale study with data on how the pandemic has affected student performance and well-being. Towards this, we plan to launch in early 2024 a PISA Happy Life dashboard, which, in addition to academic achievement, will provide insights about further dimensions of student learning in PISA in terms of overall student well-being and happiness. Overall, the 2022 assessment saw an unprecedented drop in performance across the OECD. Compared to 2018, mean performance fell by 10 score points in reading and by almost 15 score points in maths, which is equivalent to half a year's worth of learning progress in reading and 3/4 of a year's worth in mathematics. This 2022 assessment, which focuses on mathematics, saw a sharp decline in maths performance 3 times greater than any previous consecutive change. The downturn on maths results in 2022 was particularly significant in countries like Germany, Iceland, Norway, and Poland, which all saw a drop of 25 score points or more in maths. Yet, the decline in performance in all 3 fields measured can only partially be attributed to the COVID-19 pandemic. Scores in reading and science had already been falling, and negative trends in maths were already apparent prior to 2018. In Belgium, Canada, Czechia, Finland, France, Hungary, Iceland, the Netherlands, New Zealand, and Slovakia. However, there are reasons for optimism too, and there are pointers of some positive reform opportunities for the future. Despite the challenging context triggered by the pandemic, 31 countries and economies managed to at least maintain their performance in mathematics since PISA 2018. Among these, Singapore, Chinese Taipei, Japan, Korea, Switzerland, and Australia maintained or were even able to further improve on what were already high levels of student performance in 2018. A further 10 countries and economies saw both a large share of all 15-year-olds gain at least basic proficiency in maths, reading, and science, and high levels of socio-economic fairness in terms of outcomes. Canada, Denmark, Finland, Hong Kong, Ireland, Japan, Korea, Latvia, Macau, and the United Kingdom are notable examples there. And over the past decade, many countries, including Cambodia, Colombia, Costa Rica, Indonesia, Morocco, Paraguay, and Romania, have rapidly expanded education to previously marginalized populations, making significant progress towards universal secondary education. Education systems which performed comparatively better in the wake of the COVID pandemic can offer important insights and lessons on how best to deal with future crises. That is because we can observe some common features and indications of broader best practices. First, in relation to the digital transformation of education. PISA shows that most students have embraced learning through digital technologies. On average, across OECD countries, 3 out of 4 students reported being confident using various technologies, including learning management systems, school learning platforms, and video communication programs. The moderate use of digital devices in schools is associated with higher performance, but this does depend on the technology being used to support rather than distract from learning. Students who spend up to 1 hour per day learning on digital devices in school scored 14 points higher in maths than students who spent no time. This positive relationship is observed in over half of all systems with available data, even after accounting for socio-economic background. On average, across OECD countries, 45% of students reported feeling nervous or anxious if their phones were not near them, and 65% reported being distracted by using digital devices in at least some math lessons. Also, technology used excessively for leisure rather than instruction, such as mobile phones, often seems to be associated with poorer results. On average, across OECD countries, students who spend up to 1 hour a day on digital devices for leisure scored 49 points higher in maths than students who spend between 5 and 7 hours per day, after taking into account students and schools' socioeconomic profile. Students who reported being distracted by other students using digital devices in some, most or every math class scored 15 points lower in PISA maths tests than those who barely experienced this sort of distraction. This represents the equivalent of 3/4 of a year's worth of education, even after accounting for students and schools' socio-economic profile. In 13 countries and economies, more than 2/3 of students attend schools where cell phone use is prohibited, including Albania, Greece, Spain, and the United Arab Emirates. Analysis shows that distractions in these countries are lower, with consequent beneficial effects. So what PISA 2022 again confirms on this front is the need for better guidelines on how to use digital devices at schools. Second, on empowering teachers and encouraging greater parental involvement. Self-evidently, teachers are on the front line and have a central role to play in helping students and ultimately our societies deal with and adapt to the impact of a shock like the pandemic, or deal with profound structural transformations in the classroom like ever-increased digitalization. The strongest positive impact on math performance across the OECD compared to other experiences linked to the period of the pandemic related school closures was the availability of teachers to help students in need. Math scores were 15% higher on average in places where students agreed that they had good access to teacher support. These students were also more confident than their peers to learn autonomously and remotely. PISA also reinforces the importance of parental engagement in students' learning. Students who were supported at home had more positive attitudes towards school and learning, and even scored 16 to 28 points higher in mathematics than students who reported that their family does not engage on a regular basis. This was particularly true for more disadvantaged students. Yet in most education systems, parental involvement in students' learning at school decreased substantially between 2018 and 2022. Third, better targeted and more effective investment in education. Expenditure on education has increased over the past few years. Between 2012 and 2019, expenditure per student from primary to tertiary education grew at an average annual rate of 1.7% above inflation across OECD countries. PISA and the data flowing from PISA challenges the notion that higher investment in education automatically yields better educational outcomes. Our data finds that there is a positive relationship between investment in education and average performance up to a threshold of $75,000 US in spending per student up to the age of 15. But beyond that threshold, extra spending makes little difference. Many OECD countries spend beyond the point where there is a positive relationship. Countries committed to establishing top-tier education systems tend to prioritize the quality of teaching over the size of classes. This is one of the reasons why systems where teachers are highly valued as professions, such as Korea, Estonia, Finland, and Japan, are such high performers. These systems also provide funding mechanisms that align resources with needs, with special attention to vulnerable learners. In closing, high-quality education is what underpins the promise of merit-based social mobility and equality of opportunity in democratic nations. It empowers people to succeed, and it gives students the tools to adapt to a rapidly changing world, to participate in our economies and in our societies. This year's PISA provides the evidence to identify the key strengths of education systems that have performed well despite recent shocks, allowing policymakers to adapt these insights to their particular contexts, prepare for the long-term transformations of our economies and societies, and enable better education systems for a brighter, more prosperous future. With those few opening observations and without any further ado, I now hand over to Andreas Schleicher, our Director of Education and Skills, to present the 2022 PISA results in some more detail. But thank you for joining us again this morning or this afternoon, and looking forward to proceedings from here.
Thank you very much. And all I'm going to do is just underpin some of those messages with charts. PISA is the largest and most rigorous global assessment of student knowledge and skills. And the latest PISA assessment was carried out in 22. Right after the pandemic, around 690,000 15-year-old students from 81 countries took part. And schools and students were selected with rigorous sampling procedures to ensure they represent their school populations. Every PISA assessment includes some newcomers. In this round, these were El Salvador, Jamaica, Mongolia, the Palestinian Authority, and Uzbekistan. In 22, PISA covered mathematics, reading, science, and creative thinking with a focus on mathematics. And since PISA is not a traditional school test of mathematics knowledge, let me briefly outline what students had to do well. They had to demonstrate more than to remember mathematical routines. They had to show that they could think like a mathematician. They had to look at a problem from the real world and translate it into the world of mathematics. They had to solve that problem with mathematical concept and then make sense of mathematical solutions back in the real world. And countries agreed in advance on the relative importance of those tasks in the test. Some of the problems involved quantitative reasoning, things like number sense, judging, interpretations, arguments based on quantity. Other problems were more about statistics and data, so students had to form and evaluate conclusions in situations with some uncertainty. Still other tasks involved change in relationships, and some were about space and shape. And the problems were all framed in a variety of contexts, from the personal to the social to the scientific. And solving them correctly also required some 21st century skills, think like critical thinking, creativity, self-direction. If you want to get a feel for the PISA test, you find lots of sample questions on our website. So let's look at some of the results. We present them in 2 volumes. The first volume looks at the state of education globally, how students did before and after the pandemic and how those results differ by geography, by social background, by gender. And then the second volume studies resilient education systems that promoted student learning, equity, and also well-being amidst the pandemic. And there's more to come next year. We measured mathematics since 2003 in PISA, and you can see how our world has changed since then. The kind of mathematical reason that you need today is actually quite different from what was sufficient in 2003. Some things got easier, as technology is digitizing mathematical routines, but other things got harder. If you want to understand, climate change or a pandemic, you need to have a good understanding of exponentials, and you need to be able to distinguish signal from noise and think in terms of probabilities. The trouble is that across OECD countries, PISA shows that the math skills of 15-year-olds have not progressed over the last 20 years. In fact, since 2018, they have dropped very sharply by 15 score points. And if you think that 20 score points is the equivalent of a school year, you get a sense of the magnitude of that decline. And some countries drop much more. OECD's former star performer, Finland, has seen a 60 score point drop since 2003, and that's the equivalent of 3 school years. And you might think that's all because of the pandemic, but you'll see that's just part of the story here. Well, the good thing is that there is a group of countries that have bucked that trend and seen actually quite good progress over the last decade, and those countries show us in a way what's possible. We can see how Singapore moved from good to great and kept advancing during the pandemic, or look at Macau, Japan, Estonia. You can see Portugal, Hungary, Israel also seeing good progress, although they fell back a little bit recently. Turkey, remarkable progress, and Turkey was at the same time also get a lot more students enrolled into school. Romania, Moldova seen some success at the lower end of the performance spectrum. You can see how Qatar achieved remarkable progress. Montenegro, Peru, Colombia, North Macedonia also advanced. And then Brazil is another of those countries that expanded access and raised quality at the very same time. And that gets you to the international league tables for PISA, which get so much attention. But let me bring one more dimension into the picture, and that is equity and opportunity. Take a country from the middle of the league table, like the Slovak Republic, and look at the performance gap between the students from the most disadvantaged and the wealthiest families, now expressed here by the first and ninth deciles. And that social gap in the Slovak Republic almost spans the world. And when you see it, you might think poverty is destiny. But then you look at how comparably disadvantaged students in Switzerland have mathematics skills that match an average performer in the Slovak Republic. And when you look at the most disadvantaged students in Macau, you can see they almost reach the performance of the most privileged students in the Slovak Republic. And that tells us that poverty need not be destiny, and that students from all social backgrounds can succeed in the right conditions. Closing that opportunity gap is the biggest promise of a good education. If you come from a wealthy family, you'll always find open doors in life, no question. But if you come from a poor family, finding a great teacher and a good skill is often, the one single chance you have in life. If you miss that boat, you often face an uphill struggle. And the recipe for equity is not rocket science. It's all about aligning resources with needs. It's all about attracting the most talented teachers to the most challenging classrooms, and about valuing differences in our schools and classrooms now. Here you can compare the social gap represented by the green diamond with the gender gap. That's the blue diamond. And as you can see, education has done really well in closing gender gaps now in mathematics. But in most countries, particularly those on the left side, you can see the social gap remains huge. Now, one interesting finding is that the social gap has actually remained fairly stable over the last decade, and even during the pandemic. Many countries feared the pandemic would have, widened social disparities, but countries in general have been quite good in containing that now. There is one more way in which you can look at inequality. Schools can differ in their performance. You can see that here by the length of the blue bar. And student performance can differ inside schools. That's the green bar. No? I showed you that Estonia is one of the top performers in PISA, and what you can see is that virtually every school in Estonia succeeds. Now, the performance of schools does not vary greatly. No? Iceland does even better. The closest school in Iceland is always the best school. No? In contrast, in the Netherlands, school performance varies widely. No? But take a country like the United States that does not come well out on the PISA mathematics test. It ranks 28th among the 37 OECD countries. Many believe that's just a matter of, some poor schools in poor neighborhoods. But, we can see here clearly that in the US, performance variability within schools is so much greater than performance differences among schools. So underperformance in the US is not just about, poor schools in poor neighborhoods. It's about many students in many schools, in many neighborhoods. Here you see a summary of all of this. The green quadrant shows the countries that combine high academic standards with equity and learning opportunities. So what can we do to improve results? There's always a temptation to think this is all about money, but money matters for countries that invest very little. Here on the left side, the countries on the right side, and that includes most OECD countries, show a very weak relationship between spending per student and learning outcomes. And the top performer, Singapore, spends far less than Qatar, or spends equally than Qatar, but does much better. And high performer Vietnam spends similar than the Philippines and does far better. No? So money is necessary, but not sufficient. No? You can see the same when you look at the learning time. This chart shows you the number of hours that students spend learning per week in school. Now, that's the blue bar, and the number of hours they spend learning out of school. That's the green bar. And you can see there are huge differences among countries in the hours students spend learning. Now, in Morocco, students spend almost 50 hours per week. In Switzerland, it's less than 30 hours. No? But then, when you look at productivity, learning gains per hour of instruction, you can see in Switzerland, students learn a lot in very little time, whereas in Morocco, students spend a lot of time and learn very, very little. No? And keep in mind that learning is always the product of the quantity of learning opportunity and the quality of learning experiences. And those learning experiences depend on nothing more than on the quality of teachers. No? So PISA looked at that as well and found that in some countries, school principals reported significant shortages of teaching staff. Now look at Morocco or the Palestinian Authority. Interestingly, in many countries, school principals complained more about staff shortages in 22 than they had in 2018, even if actual student-staff ratios haven't got worse in most countries now. And PISA shows quite clearly that a shortage of staff can matter. You know, mathematics performance is considerably lower in countries in which principals reported a lack of teaching staff or inadequate or poorly qualified teaching staff. The same holds for shortage of assisting staff, education material, physical infrastructure, and for a lack or inadequacy of digital resources. Now, to some extent, that can be due to differences in the social mix in which schools operate, but even when you account for that, clear disadvantages remain, as you can see in the light blue marker here. So you've just seen how a lack of digital resources can mean poorer learning outcomes. Let's look at that in more detail. Here you see the time that students spent using digital devices for learning at school in blue, and the time that students use digital devices for leisure at school in green. And when you compare that with the hours students spent in regular classes, that's the dark blue diamond here, you see that the use of technology covers now much of the school day. For young people, the digital world is the real world. Students in Ukraine spend more time online for school than in school. And of course, that's because so many schools are still closed because of the war. But Guatemala shows a quite similar situation for obviously different reasons. The question is, of course, whether spending time online is a good thing or a bad thing. And the answer seems to differ depending on how technology is used. Now, when technology is used for learning, the relationship between the hours of technology use and math performance is largely flat. But when technology is used for leisure, you can see steeply declining learning outcomes. During the pandemic, remote learning became the lifeline for education, and students had to motivate themselves to learn. So we asked students if they were ready if that happens again. And interestingly, right, students in many countries seem to be fine with using video communication programs. Self-motivation is an issue. Look at Japan, where just a third of students feel they can motivate themselves to do schoolwork. And that self-motivation isn't just important in a pandemic. You need that more than anything today if you want to engage in reskilling, upskilling later in life. So how can technology impair learning? Well, you see that in most countries, a significant minority of students said they get distracted by their digital devices. And in many cases, they get distracted by other students using their devices. See the blue triangle here. In Argentina, Uruguay, Chile, that's the majority of students. You can also see that in most countries, the majority of students feel anxious when they don't have their devices near them. Look at Turkey or Malaysia, where that's almost 70% now. And what the data show is that students who feel anxious when they don't have their devices with them do a lot less well in mathematics. And that's not all. They are also less satisfied with their lives. They have a harder time managing themselves. They are less resistant to stress. All in all, when students used their smartphone at school in most mathematics lessons, they were 1.4 times as likely to be distracted than students who did not. So what can we do about it? We didn't find much of a difference in students being distracted when schools had a written policy or when teachers established, their own rules for the use of smartphones during lessons and so on. The only thing that is clearly linked to less distractions is a ban on smartphones at school, now, as indicated here by the red bar. Now. But let's get back to teachers. During the pandemic, I think it became clear to all of us that learning is not a transactional business, but a social and a relational process. So we asked students about their experiences during the pandemic. In Vietnam, almost 9 out of 10 students said their teachers were available when they needed help, and just 30% said they feel lonely. Very different in Japan, where just about 40% felt they could rely on their teachers, and an equal share felt lonely. And on average, in countries, almost 1/3 of students didn't feel that teachers were available when they needed help in the pandemic. And that's a really troubling result. What you can see here is that students who felt that their teachers were available when they needed help during the pandemic were more confident in learning on their own. And where students felt their teachers were available, they also scored roughly a school year better. And when we look more closely into that, we even found that countries where teacher support improved over those last years were generally also the ones where mathematics performance had improved. So we asked students how they were supported during the pandemic. What you can see here is on average across countries, half of the students were offered live virtual classes, got material on a learning platform, assignments, things like that. What's more troubling is that only 13% of students had someone to check in with them how they were feeling. And less than 20% said they received tips how to study on their own. And in some countries, that was less than 10%. And those actions by school had actually a significant positive impact on students' capacity for self-directed learning. Now, here on the left side. And they were also associated with reduced mathematics anxiety on the right side. And as you can see, the effects were particularly pronounced for girls and for the disadvantaged. So those actions can help schools close social gaps. One thing we observed is that private schools were generally better than public schools in handling the pandemic. And particularly, they had fewer difficulties getting in touch with students. They had fewer issues with internet access. They had more experience with remote instruction. And they were generally better prepared for digital learning, even after accounting for social background. I talked about teachers, but parents are another critical part of the learning ecosystem. And here you can see the share of schools where principals said at least half of the parents took initiatives to discuss their child's progress with the teacher. And you can see that in the Philippines, Vietnam, Kazakhstan, that is very common. If you click once, yeah. And in Norway, however, it is very rare. What is worse is that in most countries, parental engagement declined since 2018. You can see that here when you compare the green diamond for 22 with the blue bars for 2018. Look again at Norway. What's interesting is that countries where parental engagement, however, improved over the last years often saw also faster improvements in learning outcomes. And parental support isn't just about interactions with school. It's also important in families. In countries with stronger family support, for example, where parents ask their children regularly, how was school? You can see here on the horizontal axis, students generally also felt a stronger sense of belonging at school. That is the vertical axis. They also did better in mathematics. So it's worth taking a closer look at student well-being. We asked students, how satisfied, happy they were with their lives. And while you may think, for 15-year-olds, that is largely an outcome of what they experience with their friends and with things out of school, look at this. You can see by a large margin, the strongest predictors of life satisfaction were their relationship with their parents as well as their life at school. So it's really worth taking a look at experiences at school with that in mind. One aspect that schools can clearly shape is whether school is a place where students feel they belong and where they make friends easily and where they don't feel lonely. Overall, Austria and Switzerland were the countries where students felt the highest sense of belonging. And what the data show is that school safety as well as teacher support were the best predictors of student belonging. We were also interested whether students develop a growth mindset, here represented on the horizontal axis. In Estonia, students see the sky as the limit to their achievements. They trust when they work hard, their teachers are going to help them and they will be successful. In Albania, students often believe their success depends on the intelligence they were born with. And when you look at the vertical axis, which shows mathematics achievement, you see there are countries where students have more of a growth mindset. They're also typically doing better academically. And we can see a similar relationship within countries. Students with the growth mindset did generally better on the PISA mathematics test, and that was true both for students with low mathematics anxiety and for those with high levels of anxiety. And there are other many factors that matter. Students who were more curious, more persistent, who showed greater emotional control, greater stress resistance, they were generally doing better. At the other end of student well-being is bullying, and PISA looked at that too, and you can see that on average across countries, 1 in 5 students had heard a student threaten to hurt another student, and in some countries it was half, and 1 in 10 saw a student carrying a gun or a knife in school. Of course, there's a lot of variability on that. Students in Switzerland and Austria, again, feel particularly safe, but students in Jamaica and Cambodia feel particularly unsafe. And as you can imagine, students who feel less safe were less happy with their life. They felt a lower sense of belonging. They saw less capacity for self-directed learning, greater anxiety with mathematics. Finally, we looked at student absenteeism. While this has got a little better since 2018, it's still an issue in many countries. No? And what's interesting is that the third most common reason that students cited for long-term absenteeism was that they were bored. No? We should certainly be able to do something about that. No? One related aspect we looked at was food security, and it's quite surprising that in countries like the US, you have more than 1 in 5 students, and in Turkey almost 1 in 10 students, and in Turkey almost 1 in 5 who did not eat at least once a week because there was not enough money to buy food. And if you're too hungry to learn, then learning outcomes won't be that great. So let's conclude with a look at those educations that proved to be resilient during the pandemic in terms of maintaining academic standards, in terms of closing social gaps, and in terms of building a strong sense of belonging among their students. Japan, Korea, Lithuania, Chinese Taipei kept their math performance, equity, and student belonging. Singapore has stellar academic outcomes and showed resilience in equity. Switzerland has good math outcomes and maintained a student sense of belonging, a little drag on equity. Australia maintained high resilience in math performance. Hong Kong, the UK, and the US showed resilience in equity. And there's a fairly large group of countries that showed resilience in student sense of belonging. And that, too, is a remarkable achievement during those difficult years of the pandemic. There's some things we can learn from those countries and how they handled the pandemic. The obvious thing is to keep schools open for more students for longer. It's equally important that students take greater ownership over their learning beyond any pandemic. Then that's one of the key assets they are going to need for upskilling and reskilling through their lives. You saw from the data how much it matters that students have teachers who know who they are and who care who they want to become and care for their journey, and building the social foundations for learning therefore really matters. Limiting digital distractions is key, and building strong partnerships with families, but also parents' involvement in student learning are really, really important. It can be productive to divide students into ability groups in selected subjects and classes, but it often becomes counterproductive and socially divisive when students are permanently grouped at school, or when struggling students repeat a school year rather than getting the support they need to advance. Successful systems are good at aligning resources with needs, and they make schools hub for social interactions where teachers are not just great instructors, but also good coaches, good mentors, good facilitators, and good designers of more innovative learning environments. And that's why good instructional leadership and school autonomy also matter. And thank you very much. You'll find lots of more information on our website.
Thank you. Thank you, Andreas. We now have some time for some questions and answers. I'd just like to remind journalists watching over the Zoom, you can use the chat function. And for journalists in the room, my colleagues here can hand you a microphone. And if you could introduce yourselves and the name of your media outlet before asking, that would be great. Et vous pouvez aussi poser votre question en français. Just to kick things off, I've got a question here. Andreas Manuel Calvo from Spanish agency FA. Could you go into a bit more detail about this question of the limits between investment in education and the PISA results, in particular the threshold of $75,000?
Yeah, you can consider Spain beyond the point at which just spending more on the same will yield additional returns. Now, it matters much more for countries like Spain on how they invest their resources. Now, prioritizing the quality of instruction over the size of classes. Now, attracting, great talent into difficult-to-teach classes and schools. Those things do matter a lot more than just, spending more on the same.
A question from Estadão in Brazil. In addition to the pandemic, what would you say were the reasons for this drop in the scores of the most OECD member countries?
Yeah, that's a difficult question because, of course, we see the cumulative result of lots of things that have gone on. The pandemic certainly played some role. We see clearly that countries like Brazil that closed schools for longer had in generally a disadvantage in terms of learning outcomes. But we've seen other trends. You could see, digital distractions. And that is true also for students in Brazil. There's a high share of young people basically feeling anxious, distracted by their digital devices in classrooms. I think that's a factor. The decline in parental support. We have seen how important parents are, at home and also in engaging with school, and that has dropped. All of those things could have played a role in the decline of learning outcomes. Why do I say this? Because some of the countries Brazil is fortunately among the lucky countries that see, continued progress. But in most countries that have seen a decline, that has started well before the pandemic. So I do think we should not attribute that decline exclusively or even largely to the pandemic.
It's good morning from La República in Peru here. From your point of view, what's been the main result in Latin America, especially in Peru? And does economic segregation, in other words, socioeconomic levels, does it continue to be a key element in outcomes?
Well, Peru is actually one of the success stories that we have in PISA. It's seen actually a continued growth and improvement in learning outcomes over the last two decades. But, like in most other Latin American countries, large social disparities by region, by social background. I think that's the biggest challenge that Latin America faces, with very little improvement over the last 20 years. That's what we should say. The social gap has really remained very significant. Many countries in the region have got more young people into school. That's also true for Peru, but very, very few countries. You can count them on a hand. You can look at Peru, you can look at Colombia, you can look at Brazil, but there are not many more where you can actually say they're on a path of improving quality in education.
Before I ask another Zoom question, do we have any hands in the room? Any journalists in the room? Here we go, Louise, to your left.
Hello, Fabien Recker, Public Sénat. Could you be specific about the performance of France and how France did in the PISA study, please?
Yeah, if you look at France, it's seen, like most European countries, a recent drop in learning outcomes. Overall, results have been fairly stable. On a more positive note, social disparities have not got worse during the pandemic, which many people suspected. We see large social disparities, but a pretty constant pictures there. The level of teacher support has been quite limited. One of the most surprising figures for me was that many students feel that during the pandemic the teachers were not available to them. Very small share of students had teachers who asked them, how they were, showing an interest in their well-being. I think those are factors that are probably quite noteworthy for France. But overall, if you look at the long-term trend, it's been pretty kind of flat, with the exception of the recent kind of drop.
I'll go back to the Zoom then. We have a question from John Bangs from the Education Journal in the UK. Read the impact of COVID. The slow decline you referred to became a sharp drop during COVID. Doesn't that in fact indicate a very strong influence on the results from COVID?
As I said, for most countries where you see a drop, that drop was already visible before the pandemic. And there are many factors in this data set that are correlated negatively with outcomes, like digital distractions, like lack of teacher support or declining teacher support, like declining levels of parental engagement. So what we see here is the picture of all of that together. And it's very hard to disentangle the impact of COVID. But when you look at the trajectory of the countries with the steepest decline, I would not say that, the COVID pandemic has dramatically influenced them.
Thank you, Andreas. I think we had a hand up here.
Oui, Pascal Bouchard, Tout Éduc.
Pascal Bouchard.
Vous avez évoqué
You mentioned about Estonia, few differences between schools, but apparently there were significant differences within schools.
Quel est le facteur entre la différence?
So how does that play out? What's the link between few differences between schools and schools where inside the school there's great heterogeneity amongst students? Also with the problems of students being groups in different classes.
My apologies for responding in English, but you raise a really important point. How do we deal with student heterogeneity? And some countries deal with this by tracking students between different schools. The trouble that this is often, linked to social segregation. It becomes social divisive and not necessarily related to better outcomes. So dealing with, differences among students by grouping them permanently in different groups is generally not very effective. However, you mentioned Estonia. The way Estonia deals with is by actually personalizing learning in the classroom. So actually, yes, heterogeneity is very large in schools, but the system is very, very good in diagnosing where students have learning difficulties and then intervening where that is needed, with teachers given a lot of time for doing other things than teaching. Other countries deal with this by forming ability groups within schools and classes, and where this is done subject specific, it can be a good thing. Like when you actually say, well, the students differ very much in their mathematics performance, so let's divide them in groups to educate them by their ability temporarily in mathematics. That can be actually an effective policy. We see that actually countries doing that generally come out better on the PISA test. But again, you need to watch out that this doesn't become, something that then extends to all subjects and becomes stigmatizing and, tracking children. So it's a fine balance to take, really. The heterogeneity is real. In most countries, students just differ, by their abilities, by their social background, by many factors. And it's best to deal with that within schools rather than between schools. I think that's a clear message from PISA. And if you do that within schools, actually ability grouping, subject-specific, can be an effective approach. Personalizing learning probably is the best, but that obviously takes a lot of resources.
Mathieu Bosque, Journal Fakir.
Mathieu Bosque from Journal Fakir. You mentioned a drop in the involvement of parents in following up on their students' performances. Do you have explanation for this and differences amongst countries who experience this drop in parent participation?
I think during the pandemic, many of us had the impression that actually parents became more interested, more engaged, took more personal responsibility for learning. But what these data clearly show is that the overall trend went in the opposite direction, that we see, fewer parents approaching schools to, about issues about their child, that we see fewer parents even asking their children at home how was school, and you could see actually both are, contributing to a negative impact on outcomes. It's very hard for schools to compensate for parents. For a long time, many countries had this idea that, schools can make up for what parents cannot provide. We design schools that, try to provide all of those services. The reality is you do not see many systems that have been really successful with this. Now, the most successful systems are just very, very good to building effective bridges with parents. They engage them, in instruction. They basically inform them about their child's progress. They provide social emotional support, and you have that very, very strong connection. I do think, digital technologies is another example. Schools can do a lot to give parents better guidance, better advice on how to, make sense out of digital technologies rather than getting students distracted. So I do think that this is a main message from this round of PISA, that education systems should, review ways in which parents can become a more active part of the learning ecosystem. It's very, very hard to make up for what doesn't come from parental background.
We have a question here from Der Spiegel in Germany. In Germany, the results have been declining since 2018. Has education policy failed in recent years?
Well, after the initial PISA shock in 2000, we saw actually really good improvements in Germany. So it shows actually public policy can make a difference. But what is quite clear that, 2012, 2015, that kind of ambition and effort in public policy sort of leveled off. And when you sort of do not reinforce those kinds of efforts, that's what often happens, and things just slide. I do think that's quite clearly visible in Germany. There are other factors for Germany that probably have also contributed to this. Germany was quite late in digitalization. I think the pandemic really woke up schools to a new world. Germany was far less prepared than countries like Estonia that we talk about here in East Asia. I do think the decline in teacher support is also something noteworthy. Germany faces difficulty in attracting talented people into teaching, and not because it doesn't pay good salaries, it does, but because it doesn't offer teachers a really interesting job. And I do think all of those things come together and make it harder for schools to achieve good outcomes. Last point, one should also be fair. Germany has seen a massive increase in immigration over the last decade, since 2012, almost doubling the share of students with an immigrant background. Of course, that poses additional challenges, but there are plenty of countries on PISA that deal with that challenge exceptionally well. Some actually where immigrant students do better than students without an immigrant background, even after accounting for social background.
There's an interesting follow-up question here from the Education Journal, from the point of view of teachers. What was the influence of the COVID lockdowns on teachers' well-being and efficacy?
Yeah, unfortunately, this is not something PISA covers. We have a survey of TALIS, our Teaching and Learning International Survey, that will come out with results on that next year. Or collect those data next year.
General one here from a group of people to summarize. What is Singapore doing right and that other countries are not? What can other countries learn from Singapore?
Well, actually, plenty of things. First of all, Singapore has a very coherent instructional system. You know, in Singapore, students are taught few things in great depth. Rather than overloading students with a lot of material, the Singaporean education system is very judicious in what students are being taught and ensuring that depth. Singapore has an extremely attractive teaching force. No? Teachers get well paid, but they also have really amazing careers. You know, when the day you enter a school in Singapore, your principal will ask you, what do you want to do in your life? You want to go into teaching, into instructional development, design, you become a school leader, go into public policy, and then offers teachers really an interesting environment. A strong collaborative culture, great level of professional autonomy, good in aligning resources with needs, a very well-structured education system. In fact, you know, Singapore is not so hard to emulate, actually. It is an education system that is pretty well understood in its success and is pretty well designed also to see improvements. You know, you can see now what they do on digitalization. They look, you know, years ahead and plan their strategies, build their capacity and their talent. I think there's lots that we can learn from Singapore.
And then following that, so related to Singapore, are teachers in high-performing systems paid more relative to other teachers?
There's actually very little of a relationship between teacher pay and the performance of education system. I do think, you know, making teaching reasonably financially attractive is important, but what matters a lot more is to make teaching intellectually more attractive. And that is, you know, offering people interesting careers, you know, differentiated, valuing success and performance of teachers to ensure that, you know, teachers who do an amazing job get the recognition and the opportunities to advance in their careers. Also, the collaborative cultures of teachers, we see very clearly that where teachers, you know, do more to observe each other's lessons, engage more in collaborative professional development, and so on. They generally are happier with their job, and they generally are also seeing themselves as more effective. So I think there's a lot that countries can do without spending more money to make teaching a lot more attractive. No? Finland is a poster child of that. You know, Finland doesn't pay its teachers particularly well, but they still get, you know, 8-9 applicants for every teaching post.
Thank you, Andreas. We have no more questions on the Zoom. If we have no more hands in the room, we will close the press conference part of the event. If there's any journalists that need to leave now before the panel discussion, then please do. Otherwise, I encourage everyone to stay for the panel discussion with the ministers starting at 12. Thank you.
And we continue with the launch of the 2022 PISA results, and I very warmly welcome my good friend, Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal, Prime Minister of Ukraine, the Deputy Prime Minister Ju Ho-ee, Minister Kristina Kallas for Estonia, and Minister Masahito Moriyama for Japan. Thank you for joining us remotely to discuss the 2022 PISA results for your countries. The results from this 8th round of PISA point to several challenges impacting on educational performance. Yes, self-evidently, in this edition of PISA, we see the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, which, of course, has been material, but which is really only partly to blame for the decline in overall educational performance. There's also the impact of the distractions from digital devices, and we can see some of the common features of high-performing systems across the PISA 2022 results. Ukraine, Korea, Estonia, and Japan have all demonstrated exceptional strength and resilience of their educational systems. Ukraine's participation in the 2022 edition of PISA is in fact a stark demonstration of this strength and resilience under exceptionally difficult circumstances. As a result of Russia's ongoing war of aggression, fewer than 1/3 of schools across Ukraine were operating on an in-person basis by the end of 2022. PISA results show how strongly committed Ukrainian teachers are to ensuring support and continuity of learning for their students. 67% of students in Ukraine, in fact, reported that in most mathematics lessons, teachers showed interest in their learning, and 70% of students reported that teachers gave them extra help, even as required. In addition, 84% of Ukrainian students reported that they felt a sense of belonging at school, which is well above the OECD average, and an achievement that lays the groundwork for a stronger education system and a brighter future. And as I say, the fact that Ukraine participated in the 2022 edition of PISA is in itself an incredible achievement. Korea's economic transformation over the past 60 years has been truly remarkable, and investment in education has been central to its success. Korean students are leading the charts in mathematics performance. 84% of students attained the minimum proficiency level in mathematics, well above the OECD average of 69%, and 23% of Korea's 15-year-olds were top performers in mathematics as compared to the OECD average of 9%. Korea also stands out as leaders in the use of digital technologies in education and was among the countries that limited schools closures during the pandemic. Korea's education system also shows high level of teacher and parental engagement, all very important factors in educational success, as has been already talked about quite extensively this morning. Estonia is an undisputed global leader in e-governance and in the use of digital technologies in education. Students in Estonia scored higher than the OECD average in mathematics, reading and science, and more students in Estonia than on average across OECD countries were top performers in at least one of those three subjects. By investing in a robust digital infrastructure, since the 1990s, Estonia fostered a culture of innovation which extended into the school system. In fact, in Estonia, fewer students, just 17%, reported inadequate or poor quality digital resources compared to the average of 25% across the OECDs. Japan's educational success is the country's commitment to equality of opportunity. Japan hits one of its highest scores in PISA 2022 in mathematics and science, and Japan's education system is notable for its efforts to narrow the gap between advantaged and disadvantaged students. Between 2012 and 2022, the gap in mathematics performance between the top and the bottom 25% of students in terms of socioeconomic status remains stable. In Japan, a student's socioeconomic status has less of an impact on educational outcomes than across the OECD on average. A key aspect of this approach is the uniformity of high-quality educational standards across the country. Teachers in Japan are highly respected and well-trained, ensuring that students receive quality instruction. With 84% of students reporting that teachers gave extra help when needed, a remarkable 18 percentage points increase since 2012, and one of the few OECD countries that is on a positive trajectory in 2022 compared to previous editions. Ukraine, Korea, Estonia and Japan are only some of the PISA success stories, but we felt it was a great opportunity to showcase some of those important successes as part of this launch here today. And I again thank the Prime Minister, the Deputy Prime Minister and Ministers for joining us here for this panel this morning. The results that have been achieved by your countries and ministries, and indeed some of your counterparts across the globe, give us some actionable data in support of your continued reform efforts, but also of reform efforts in countries all around the world. I'm pleased to share the relevant results with you and look forward to your exchanges here this morning.
Thank you very much, Mathias. I think you've just shown us that there is a good number of countries that actually buck the global downward trend in education performance. And we're really fortunate to have leaders from some of those countries with us here to tell us about how they got there. Prime Minister Schleicher, many countries saw that steep drop in learning outcomes during the pandemic. Ukraine has not just, had the experience of the pandemic, but you find yourself in the middle of a devastating war that has imposed unimaginable hardship on students, on teachers, on schools. And yet, unlike other countries, Ukraine has not seen a decline in its learning outcomes. It held its ground in academic outcomes. And I think also you provide a role model for the world in terms of how teachers support their students, not just academically, but also socially and emotionally, and including many of the displaced students. Prime Minister, tell us the secret of educational resilience. The microphone.
Dear Mathias, Excellencies, dear ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to have this opportunity to address you on the occasion of Ukraine's participation in the program for international student assessment. Every day, the Ukrainian people fight for their independence and for their future. This future is embodied in our children, in our students of thousands of Ukrainian schools who will rebuild and develop Ukraine tomorrow. Learning is always more than just acquiring knowledge, skills, and abilities. It is character building. It is an introduction to the values and principles of humanity, freedom, and democracy. All this is the basis for the existence and work of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. When the world faces challenges to its values, education is particularly important. Today is such a moment. Only educated, active, thinking, and conscious citizens will be able to make the right choices, be creative, find a way out of crisis situations, and achieve new results. For Ukraine in general, and for the government in particular, the development of education system is an absolute priority. This is the foundation on which we will build a post-war state, a strong, competitive, innovative state integrated into the European space. It is important for us not only to provide students with knowledge. It is important to develop their skills to apply this knowledge in practice. It is important to develop adaptability in today's changing world. Another aspect is particularly relevant in times of war. This is critical thinking and the ability to counter enemy propaganda. We can see how Russian citizens have been programmed for hatred, aggression, and war for several decades. Through various information platforms and agents of influence, the Kremlin is trying to spread its propaganda in Ukraine, Europe, and around the world. And it is the education system that must create effective safeguards against this. The most important safeguard is the ability to think, to analyze, to see cause and effect relationships, not to simplify the picture of the world, but to understand it in its entirety. And at the same time, to understand clearly where there is a good and where there is an evil. Building a 21st century education system in Ukraine is not an abstract slogan, but a very realistic task. To be successful, we need to have a clear understanding of the strengths and weakness of the education sector. It is necessary to have a holistic vision of the expected outcome and clear benchmarks for growth. The PISA scores allow us to see how successful we are on this path. If necessary, we can adjust our strategy to achieve the goal. This is why Ukraine has been participating in the program for international student assessment since 2016. For us, this is a valuable experience that has concrete, positive, and very practical results. The results of the previous cycle of the study drew our attention to the working condition of teachers. We want to ensure that high prestige of this profession and decent pay for people who are currently shaping the future of our country in the extremely difficult conditions. In 2022, we participated in the international survey for the second time. The report presented today is a source of important data on what we can be proud and what we need to work on more carefully. This phase of the survey took place under extreme conditions, as Mr. Secretary General noted. Air raids, shelling, constant stress. Despite all the difficulties, more than 3,800 students from 164 educational institutions in Ukraine took part in the assessment in the autumn of 2022. I would like to thank the Ukrainian teachers and organizers for this result, and also for their daily hard work. Since the beginning of the full-scale war, Russia has destroyed more than 350 educational institutions and damaged another 3,400. But it has not broken our will. Ukrainian schools are functioning, teachers are teaching, and we are building reliable, modern shelters to protect every child. We will stand our ground and we will make every effort to ensure that our education system is stable and effective. I am sincerely grateful to the OECD for its ongoing and systematic support to Ukraine in the field of education and science. Our cooperation will continue. We have already signed an agreement to participate in PISA 2025. On behalf of Ukrainians, I would like to thank Secretary General Mathias Cormann and Director for Education and Skills Andreas Schleicher for their continued solidarity. We really appreciate it. Together we will win, rebuild and discover a new space for development and prosperity. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for your support. Thanks to every our partner. Glory to Ukraine. Slava Ukraini.
Thank you, Prime Minister. I know you can't stay with us for longer, but I really want to thank you for joining us and for the hope you provide for education in Ukraine and in the world, actually, as a role model as well, how we can build resilience and keep education going and flourishing even in the most difficult circumstances. And I will be with you in Kiev just next week. Let me turn to you, Deputy Prime Minister Lee. Half a century ago, Korea was one of the least developed education systems in the OECD area. Today, it's at the top of the charts in academic performance. But what I was most impressed by is how you were able to maintain those outcomes during the pandemic and reconcile them with improving levels of student well-being, which used to be a challenge in Korea. In a way, you know, the world got used to Korea doing well academically, but what the world is now seeing, that you are also actually providing strong sense of belonging. And we saw that the 10% most disadvantaged 15-year-olds in Korea now get pretty close to the performance of the average American in PISA. That's truly impressive. Tell us your secret about how Korea achieved that.
Thank you, Andreas. 한국이 코로나 이후 교육
Korea's high resilience in educational recovery post-COVID can be attributed to four major factors. First is the excellent remote education infrastructure. Korea has high-speed internet networks worldwide, and we support the pandemic. Wireless networks were installed in classrooms, and now with wireless APs in every classroom, various types using personal devices and internet are being conducted. Along with this, each region's educational office, with a commitment to digital transformation in education, has promoted the distribution of one device per student. This excellent internet environment has minimized infrastructure-related obstacles to remote education, facilitating smooth communication between students and teachers, which I believe is one of the reasons of Korea's high resilience in education recovery. The second factor is dedication of teachers. Due to the COVID pandemic, the teachers had to teach remote unprepared. They had to introduce new teaching learning methods necessarily in the online environment. Even in remote learning, the classes quickly transitioned from one-way lectures to interactive engagements, and more teachers developed contents themselves for remote lessons. The teachers also paid attention to students' emotional management. In fact, according to PISA survey results, 55% of Korean students responded that they received daily support through real-time online classes. Despite the unprecedented situation from COVID, there were active efforts and dedication from teachers to push ahead with online classes. The last factor is Korea's high enthusiasm for education. Korean parents are highly invested in education and have great interest in their children's academic performance and career paths. As mentioned in the PISA report, parents' support and interest is thought to be significantly related to stable and higher learning outcomes. Even during the COVID pandemic, Korean parents would have utilized various extracurricular learning methods, such as private academies, online learning contents, and experiential activities. Such extracurricular learning is inevitably influenced by students' socioeconomic backgrounds. Therefore, Korea is striving to reduce the reliance on private education and promote innovation in public education as well as personalized education to cultivate post-COVID talents. In the era of digital transformation, we aim to realize personalized education for all students through educational innovation using digital technology. We will have the opportunity to talk more about this shortly. Finally, public-private partnership was also a crucial factor. During the transition to online learning, the participation and collaboration of private telecommunications and IT companies enabled a significant increase in network capacity in a short period. Additionally, the opening of content by private publishers and content companies, as well as the expertise of public-private educational platform organizations like EBS and KERIS, contributed to the transition to online learning and ultimately helped minimize learning loss for students. So, I hope this explains how Korea, despite the COVID pandemic, was able to maintain PISA results. We do not consider the pandemic as a time of learning loss for students. The Korean government does not think of it as a loss either. Instead, we view it as a time of opportunity to take a new leap forward. Especially in education, the pandemic gave us a chance to reconsider non-cognitive aspects like students' social and emotional well-being. I would like to thank you again for organizing today's event and that Korean efforts could serve as a good example. I also look forward to learning from the efforts and policies of other participating countries. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Juho, and really impressive. And I hope you can share some of that enthusiasm of the Korean Society for Education with the rest of the world. But also the examples you cited of deliberate public policy, whether it's about integrating, extracurricular activities into school days, and your relentless drive to capitalize on the forces of digitalization. I think these are just very, very impressive kind of outcomes. Let me turn to you, Minister Kallas. Estonia has been Europe's rising star in PISA actually for quite some time, and despite actually quite modest financial investments in education, Estonia spends a lot less than most OECD countries and still, sees improving, rising outcomes. And you're not just at the frontier of academic achievement, but in so many ways, you were one of the few countries that embraced both technological and social innovation actually well before the pandemic. Tell us more about that culture of innovation that keeps Estonia moving forward.
Thank you, Andreas. Warm welcome from very cold and snowy Estonia. Of course, we are very happy about our current round of PISA results here in Estonia, because we did have concerns how the pandemic has impacted Estonian children's performance and the general education system performance, but we can see that we actually coped with the pandemic quite well. And I think the reasons behind that is this, what you name as an innovation approach or innovation mindset, and this is something that has been accompanying Estonian society at least last 3 decades since the regaining of independence. And the fundamental of this innovation mindset is the belief that things can get better, and it only depends on us, on our effort, whether things can get better or not. So this belief that we can do our life better, this is very fundamentally ingrained in Estonian society since the regaining of independence, and a lot of innovation has happened in education system due to this mindset. That is very dominant in a society, and we see also from these PISA results that Estonian children do believe in a dominant majority that actually it very much depends on their own efforts and in their own will to progress in education and in many aspects in the life. So this growth mindset is continuously throughout the generations quite dominant. Also, I think that because coming from a country coming from extreme circumstances of economic realities and geopolitical realities, education has always been a central or a fundamental aspect of the society where people invested, because that was a trajectory to believe that things can get better if you invest in education. So in this sense, in a social standing, education has a very strong position in a society, and belief that through education the progress and the innovation is happening. Just to correct maybe the question of resources in Estonian education, indeed for a couple of decades these resources were very modest, because the Estonian state itself was among not the high top earner countries in terms of economic impact input, but we are currently actually financing quite a significant part of our GDP to education. It's more than 6% of the GDP that goes to education. So Estonia has increased significantly its resources that are invested in education. And our resilience, if you allow me to point out in our education system, why Estonia has been the rising star in Europe in education system, is based on probably maybe the foresight process in the governance side of education, or the government governance side of education, where we have started focusing on the future skills, including digital skills of students and teachers quite early on. So students' digital skills have been focused in the curricula since 2011 already. So it has been really a focus of the curricula to develop the student skills, but also for the last couple of around 5 years, we have been focusing on developing teachers' digital skills. not so much developing or bringing technology into schools, but to focusing on the competencies, digital competencies of the teachers, meaning how to teach using the modern technology and how the learning process takes place through technology. So when the pandemic happened, which is not something that we expected, of course, but when the pandemic happened, our teachers and our students were quite prepared to change the learning environment from classroom to the digital or distance mode. Teachers had, in dominance, had respective competencies how the learning and teaching process could take place through the digital means rather than in the classroom. So if you might call it a foresight that we have been doing this for some time now already, focusing on the digital competencies, but it is something that we are very aware that this is actually an increasing future skills area in education, and with the arrival of AI in our education systems all over the world, we need to focus clearly on teachers' competencies in terms of using big data machines in education. So it's a next level of developing teachers' competencies regarding the AI, and this is what Estonian education governance is currently focusing on as well. So to sum up is that Estonia has increased significantly actually also the financial resources from the state to focus on education, to invest in education. We have focused on digital competencies of our teachers and students quite a lot, not so much on the technology, using technology in the classroom, but rather on competence levels. And we still have a very strong social support in education, and the belief that education is the way to continue progress, whether personal progress or the progress of the nation as such. This belief is very much supporting our education system. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Minister Kallas. And I think the point that you made, that the growth mindset is not just visible among Estonian students, but it's a feature of the entire system. I think it's a really, really interesting and compelling point. Also, you know, you referenced that digitalization in education is not primarily about technology, but about building the competencies of people. And we heard the same from Prime Minister Schleicher, actually. You know, can young people navigate ambiguity? Can they manage complexity? Can they think critically? Can they develop their own kind of viewpoints on things in a confusing world? And artificial intelligence is never a magic power. It's just, you know, an amazing amplifier, an incredible accelerator. It's going to amplify good ideas and good practice in the same way it amplifies bad ideas and bad practice. And it's ethically neutral, but it's always in the hands of people who are not neutral. So I think your emphasis on, you know, getting teachers ready for that and getting learners ready for this, I think is a really, really compelling point. Let me turn to Japan. Minister Moriyama, Japan has always been a star performer in PISA. That's nothing new. We saw that since the very first assessment. But what strikes us from this year is that schools in Japan are not just delivering excellent academic results, but they deliver that for students from all social backgrounds. And they also are building an exceptionally strong student sense of belonging at school. And I think that in our times is critically important as well. So tell us more how Japanese teachers provide both, you know, quality instruction and at the same time support their students as individuals.
Okay. I'm Moriyama Masahito, Minister of Education, Culture, Sports, Science and Technology of Japan. I'm under Prime Minister Sumiha has already left from this online meeting session. First of all, as I am a Secretary General of Japan-Ukraine Member of Parliament Friendship Group, I have been making efforts to support Ukraine. We, the Japanese government, we support Ukraine, not only education, but also every field. As a Minister of Education, we will support Ukraine children's study. Back to OECD PISA, as I am an alumni of being seconded to the OECD, it is quite a privilege for me to have a chance to speak in this session today. For answering the question in detail, first, let me briefly review Japan's results again. These are some characteristics of Japan's results this time, particularly in comparison with the results from the 2018 assessment. The mean score for mathematics overall improved, and for both the top 25% and the bottom 25% of the ESCS index improved. Japan showed the greatest increase among all OECD member countries in the mean value for the sense of belonging at school index. These results show that Japan has overcome the disruptions caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. As defined by the OECD, Japan's education system is categorized as a resilient education system that is better prepared to enable students to continue learning even under adverse circumstances. As a background factor of these results, first of all, the OECD points out the fact that the period of school closures in Japan was shorter than for other countries. At each school, teachers made every effort to reopen their school while taking various preventive measures against the infection and took every possible measure to ensure learning opportunities through direct face-to-face communication between the teacher and the students, and also communication among the students. We believe that such efforts to enrich learning that only school can provide likely contributed to Japan's results. Moreover, teachers and boards of education made great efforts not to allow children learning to stop even during this period. Specifically, we believe that their efforts to continue instruction using textbooks and other paper teaching materials, as well as internet-connected computer terminals, and to provide appropriately readjusted learning guidance, taking into account the situation of children after the reopening of schools, are both linked to the PISA results for Japan this time. In addition, Japan has been making greater efforts than ever before for bringing out the potential of all children. These various efforts, including improvement of classroom instruction based on the current national curriculum standards, and preparation of ICT environments in schools and students' growing familiarity with using ICT devices in the classroom, have had a cumulative impact on Japan's results. Next, I would like to introduce some of our country's fundamental efforts for realizing education aimed at unlocking the potential of all children. The OECD's Learning Compass 2030 highlights the need for students to navigate unknown environments by their own initiative and to find the direction they should take. Along this direction suggested by the OECD, Japan is showing the direction of its educational policies in our integrated enhancement of personalized and self-regulated learning and collaborative learning, model for realizing education that unlocks the potential of all children. The aim of this model is the integrated enhancement of personalized and self-regulated learning that is tailored to each child's interests and learning speed, and of collaborative learning that deepens learning by contact with diverse sensibilities and ways of thinking, which is mutually stimulating for the students. Hence, the preparation of ICT environments is crucial for achieving this kind of learning. As of the end of March 2021, almost every student had been provided with a computer terminal by government funding so that learning would not be delayed by the COVID-19 pandemic. In conclusion, we believe that these fundamental efforts for realizing the education aimed at unlocking the potential of all children has partially have had a cumulative impact on Japan's results of PISA 2022, including the greatest increase among all OECD member countries in the mean value for the sense of belonging at school index. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister Moriyama. And actually, it's a very important reminder that, you know, good results never come out by chance. They're actually really the result of very intentional, deliberate efforts. Particularly your efforts during the pandemic, I think, are remarkable examples of how we can actually address a crisis. I think your emphasis on self-regulated learning, on collaborative learning, on building student agency through education. You can see the fruits that this is born over the last years. We have some time for questions, and I'm going to open the floor momentarily. But let me ask my first question to our panelists here. You've all explained to us how you got to where you are, and that was in a way the easy part. But how do you envisage the future? You know, and what steps are you going, or are you putting in place to realize that vision of the future? Juho, may I start with you? I think we.
네. 네, 그 미래에 대해서 대한민국은 지금 굉장히
for the future, the Korean government is making all the preparations with the advancements of the digital technology. I believe education and learning also need to transition to a personalized approach. Korea is especially facing many challenges, including rapid decrease in student population. Therefore, there's a greater need for personalized education tailored to each student. With the development of digital technology, personalized individual learning for students have become possible, which realizes the United Nations Declaration of Education for All. Korea plans to build on the accumulated digital learning ecosystem and the experience of digital transformation during the pandemic to implement personalized learning for all students by introducing the world's first AI digital textbooks. Starting in year 2025, this will be applied first to English, math, and IT subjects, and will be gradually expanded to other subjects by 2028. The teaching and learning with digital technology will serve as an effective tool for cognitive learning. In this context, the Korean Ministry of Education emphasizes another pillar of students' social and emotional growth, which are mental and emotional health. Accordingly, we are planning to increase mental health programs, including school physical activities and diverse after-school programs. From 2024, we will set up a team dedicated to emphasizing policy priorities. And as OECD also places emphasis on this area, we hope to continue strengthening cooperation in this aspect. For these new challenges, the role of teacher is most important, as emphasized before. In line with the introduction of digital textbooks, we plan to conduct large-scale teacher training, and by 2028, we aim to equip all teachers with digital competencies. It is important that teachers are not replaced by artificial intelligence, but perform a more sophisticated and specialized role as learning designers. And for this, the trainings will focus on the high-touch aspects. They cannot be replaced by technology.
학생들의 사회 정서 발달,
마음
건강에
For social and emotional development, as well as emotional health of students, the teachers play an important role. Therefore, we will emphasize this aspect. Alongside this, the Ministry of Education has launched Together School, which is an online policy communication platform. It enables real-time communication with teachers to receive policy feedback and hear about challenges in real classrooms. This outlines our efforts in Korea to realize the vision of personalized education for all. And I emphasize that we will continue cooperation with the OECD. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Deputy Prime Minister. I think I really like your phrase, high-tech, high-touch education. I think it is that combination, that magic combination that brings together the enabling features of technology with the human ones of teachers. I think very, very impressive. In fact, a few weeks ago when I visited you, I was very impressed by your digital textbooks, the first AI-based, systematic AI-based approach to actually give young people individual tutors in a system. I think that's very impressive. I think your efforts to invest in capacity, this is certainly a massive challenge to get not just students, teachers, maybe even parents ready for that. I think it's very, very impressive to do that at the scale of a large country like Korea. And then your relentless attention to mental health and the effort to integrate the extracurricular with the curricula. I think these are really, really good signs for a different future for education. Minister Kallas, may I pose the same question to you? You have explained to us how you got to where Estonia is. How do you see the future?
Thank you. Indeed, it's quite similar what has been said here already before, that building student agency, and I think that focusing on student as a learner who designs its own learning paths is something that everybody is going the way it's going, so that every learner in the system has an opportunity to actually learn. And for that, we also, of course, can use digital technologies, but not only digital, but also AI systems to do the teacher assistance to students, so that the teachers themselves can develop and focus in future learning in higher level cognitive skills of children, because we do know and realize that the future of education has a quite demand for higher level cognitive skills, whether this is analytical skills or system thinking skills or critical thinking skills, and that the capacity to compare, to the communication skills in different contexts and environments. So these are the skills that teachers are there, and the teachers themselves need to be trained in how to develop those higher level cognitive skills in children. And the AI and the arrival of AI in education system is something that we in Estonia also pay very much attention, because that's the future of education. Rather than regulating it and focusing on how to regulate AI, we need to see the ways how we can help the AI to enhance certain learning processes and teaching process in education system. So I think that's also the future. What we see from Estonian education, maybe a matter of concern that we need to focus on dealing with is this socioeconomic gap and the education inequality. I think this is what is probably the challenge in all education systems equally. And this is something that we would definitely need to pay attention, because the top performing education systems are the ones that lift all the boats equally, not just lifting part of the students, some of the students in the system, but all the students equally. So it's the capacity of education system to support the maximum number of students in their learning paths. And I think that's something that we all need to very much pay attention. So I think that the future of education is very much on focusing on students' agency, focusing on developing higher cognitive skills of the learners. For that, you need to focus on teacher training and teacher professional and competencies levels on that. And the third trend is definitely including and integrating AI into education systems of our countries.
Thanks so much, Minister Callas. And in fact, you know, this concept of student agency and self-directed learning seems to be almost like a red thread through all of your kind of efforts to build the future, as does the focus on equity and opportunity. In fact, I also think this is a really strong common feature among the three top-performing education systems that we have here, that they get, you know, students from all social backgrounds achieve at very high levels. I think you have all made that work. Minister Moriyama, when countries have to catch up, it's easy to look to others who are in front of you, but when you're at the top of the league tables, it's much harder to imagine the future. So we will all be very interested in your perspective on how you see the future of education in Japan and what you are doing to realize that vision.
Okay. From Japan, I'd like to show you the future shape of learning in Japan that has evolved for overcoming the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and for further fostering the qualities and abilities in children. First, one of the most important points for students' learning is to acquire basic and fundamental knowledge and skills. Once they acquire them, they could be able to overcome various social changes. This pandemic made us recognize again 3 points about the role and significance of schools. Schools ensure learning opportunities and academic performance, ensure the holistic development, and support the physical and mental health of students. In Japan, guidance on school subjects, lifestyles, cleaning, nutrition, and so on is provided in an integrated way. This Japanese-style school education seeks to foster solid academic ability, richness in mind, and a healthy body. The COVID-19 pandemic put many restrictions on educational activities. But in Japan, rather than just a return to pre-COVID-19 education, we are aiming to develop new models of learning that transcend pre-pandemic education. In order to deal with the decline in opportunities for collaborative learning and experimental activities, and the impact on students' physical and mental health, we are making specific efforts to promote nature and cultural and artistic experiences, and integrated promotion of community schools and its cooperative activities, and to assign more school counselors and social workers to schools. Japan is aiming to achieve new learning that has evolved to overcome the impact of COVID-19 while promoting efforts for recovery, digital permeation, and learning updates. The COVID-19 pandemic made it clear that schools provide opportunities for face-to-face and collaborative learning, fulfill the functions of serving as a place to stay for children as a social safety net, and contribute to the improvement of the well-being of children. Schools are also an invaluable foundation for developing respect for diverse others and creating an inclusive society. In conclusion, we'd like to continue to effectively fulfill these roles of schools and to work with all of you in each country to contribute to realization of diverse and inclusive societies through education. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Minister Moriyama. And I think the most important takeaway from all of this for us is that, you know, high-performing education systems do not stop. They continue to reinvent themselves. And after the pandemic, they have not built back better, as we often say, but they have built forward very differently, and they have a clear vision for their future. They invest in capacity. We heard 3 really impressive examples here. They leave no one behind. They focus on equity and opportunity, and they don't make students passive learners, but actually active learners that focus on student agency. Very, very impressive. Do we have questions?
If there's any questions in the audience, then please raise your hand.
Yeah, in front.
Merci. Oui, encore moi.
Thank you. It's me again.
Tous les ministres là, sauf le ministre japonais.
All ministers except the Japanese minister stressed tailor-made education using artificial intelligence to suit the needs of every child. Are we not losing out on the other facet of education, which is cooperation amongst peers, group dynamics, everything that makes teaching collective, everything that means that teaching creates a sense of belonging? For individuals to support each other so that a child can explain things to another child. Are we not losing out on this collective dimension?
You know, I leave our ministers respond to this, but actually for me that is one of the most impressive features of certainly Japan and Korea, that teachers actually have much more of a culture to work together. They observe each other's lessons. They, engage in lesson study. They engage in collaborative practice. They engage as researchers, as designers of innovative learning environments. They spend more time with students outside the classrooms than teachers in Europe. So in a way, I think what you're looking for is something that those education systems can clearly pride themselves of, and that makes them really different from education in the Western world, where we have often, seen a trend towards commodifying learning. Students became passive consumers, teachers became some kind of service providers, and parents client. I think what you can actually see there is how there is a very strong level of professional autonomy, but at the same time, a very strong collaborative culture. But I let, the ministers talk to their systems in this respect. Who would like to take the floor? Minister Moriyama, please.
Hi. In Japan, we are facing the serious problem of teachers overwork. So we have to change this situation. It may be one of the reasons why our Japanese students made a high score than European or other countries. But we have to change our system. It is a serious problem. And using IC technology, we'd like to shorten teachers' working hours. And in 3 or 4 years period, we provided every children, starting from 6-year-old, elementary school, first grade, all of them had their own device to learn. And it made possible to teach and respond by teacher and their children, each other. That's one merit. But we are wondering that is, the reality is more important than internet technology or virtual world. So we are aiming to stress the real world. For example, to use pencils and to use scissors, or to go out and find their own eye, their own ear, and their own feelings to feel the reality. That's the most important thing. to learn. And as responding to the question, the cumulative study, perhaps the questioner's question is how we could respond to the questioner, but as a class, we are aiming to make it under around 35 student class. Of course, we are using IC technology, but also to study in the real world, to discuss and to go out and to play each other. That is our, that may be our answer to you. It may not satisfy your question. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Moriyama. Juho, you have raised your hand as well. Please. Yes.
제가 좀 답변드리겠습니다.
Yes, let me answer that question.
AI가 굉장히 완벽하게 앞으로 이제
I believe that AI will play a great role in teaching the students. So I believe that the education for all, the UN's goal, it will help achieve it. However, as you just mentioned, knowledge is only part of learning, and it is very important that students become more social, and emotional growth is also accompanied. Therefore, and also this can be achieved by many different methods, like extracurricular or physical education, high-touch education, and AI intelligence. It is important to attempt many different ways to combine these two. Therefore, we are planning to launch a training next year, but it is very important that the teachers also themselves have a sense of urgency and continue to try to develop this area. And also, they will continue, and they would need to continue to find new ways of teaching and explore them in order for this to succeed. So this will lead to a great transition in the classroom. And in order to overcome this challenge, we will need continuous research. And in Korea, the AI textbook is forging new way with the introduction of AI textbook, and I'm sure that there will be many challenges ahead. So I hope that we hope to collaborate with many international organizations, such as the OECD, to make new innovation.
Thank you so much. And Minister Kallas, do you have the final word? We are out of time, but I'll give you a chance.
I have to excuse because I don't have a translation and my French is not so good, so I'm not sure that I understood the question. The
question was really about how to create with all the personalization, how to keep teaching as a kind of collaborative profession.
I mean, personalization in our case, we don't mean that everybody will be individually locked somewhere and doing just individual work. I mean, personalization in our case, at least that's how we conceptualize it in education, means that the personal capacities could be taken to the maximum. And now the teacher who has 33 kids in the classroom, that's very difficult to do because there's not enough attention and time for each child's personality and personal development capacities. But with the help of AI, that could be enhanced quite significantly because the most crucial element in education is actually feedback and evaluation for you, how your learning is taking place and where are your gaps, for example, and where you need to have a more skills development. And for that, AI could be very helpful in providing evaluation and feedback regarding the progress in the work. But of course, I think what education systems, at least in Estonia, what we see is that we need to decrease the size of the classroom. because indeed we also have the problem of teachers overload, and this overload comes from the education demand in terms of having more individualized and personal approach to each child in order to maximize the capacity of each child to develop the student agency there as well. And that one teacher per 33 kids is just not capable of doing that, and quite often teachers are at the point of breakdown because there is an extremely high overload. So what we are discussing in Estonia is definitely decreasing the class sizes so that this personalized approach can be more enhanced in the classroom. But I think that this is definitely the future of education. And I very much agree with Japanese minister that actually learning human to human, doing human interaction is something that is essential in education, because most of the learning, including the development of those very high cognitive skills that are very essential for the future skills in general, these can happen in human-to-human interaction. It does not happen human-to-computer interaction. So in this sense, I think teacher is continuously the crucial element in developing the learning path for the students, and especially the personalized learning path. I think teachers' role there is crucial.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Deputy Prime Minister Lee, Minister Moriyama, Minister Kallas, thank you for your contribution, but more importantly for the leadership you provide for creating a better world through education. And we have to close the session now. Thank you again.